We will give it a few seconds to let everyone join in. Okay. Hello and welcome to all the participants who have registered to join us today for this expert roundtable on the policy on the crimes against humanity of gender persecution, released last December by the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. This event is the third in our series devoted to the OTP's policy on gender persecution. In this conversation, we will discuss the definition of targeted groups as one of the elements of gender persecution. My name is Cindy Abate, and I'm a legal officer at the Public International Law and Policy Group, and I'm honored to be guiding the conversation with these esteemed experts today. The ICC Rome Statute definition of gender persecution provides that women, men, children, and LGBTQI+ persons are targeted on the basis of their gender. During this roundtable, our experts will discuss how perpetrators use gender-based crimes to regulate or punish those whom they perceive as transgressing the accepted norms of gender expression. Perpetrators may target groups due to real or perceived roles, behaviors, activities, attributes, or other forms of expression. Our experts today will also explore how such criteria are used by perpetrators during times of conflict or mass atrocity to regulate every aspect of life, determining the extent of individuals' freedom of movement, their reproductive options, whom they can marry, where they can work, how they can dress, and whether they're simply allowed to exist. We are joined today by Professor Lisa Davis, Victor Madrigal-Borlos, Professor Valerie Oosterveld, and Patricia Sellers. The roundtable will be 60 minutes long. We ask that you please submit any questions you have for our speakers using the Q&A function, and we will do our best to answer your questions throughout the event. Now, let me introduce our panelists. We are honored to welcome Professor Lisa Davis, Special Advisor on Gender Persecution to the International Criminal Court Prosecutor and an Associate Professor of Law and co-director of the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic. Professor Davis has written and reported extensively on international human rights and gender issues, including women's rights and LGBTQI+ rights, with a focus on peace building and security issues in conflict and disaster settings. I am thrilled to introduce Victor Madrigal-Borlos, who was appointed as a UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity in late 2017. His initial 3-year term started on 1st January 2018. He's the second independent expert to serve in this capacity. A Costa Rican jurist, Mr. Madrigal-Borlos is a senior visiting researcher at Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program, in residence at Harvard Law School from July 2019 to December 2023. Welcome to Professor Valerie Oosterveld, full professor at Western University's faculty in Canada, and the director of her university's Center for Transitional Justice and Post-Conflict Reconstruction. She has published widely on the interpretation of sexual and gender-based crimes by international criminal tribunals and on gender-sensitive investigation and prosecution. She has served on the Canadian delegation to various international criminal court-related negotiations, including the Assembly of States Parties, the 2010 Review Conference, and the 1998 Conference on the Establishment of the ICC. In this latter role, she negotiated various gender provisions. And welcome to Patricia Sellers, Special Advisor for Slavery Crimes for the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and previously the Special Advisor for Gender for the Office of the former prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. Patricia Sellers served as the Legal Advisor for Gender, acting head of the Legal Advisory Section, and the prosecutor at the Yugoslav Tribunal from 1994 to 2007. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for agreeing to participate in today's panel. To begin, I would like to go back to the definition of targeted groups that I briefly touched upon in the introduction. Lisa, could I ask you to expand on what are targeted groups for gender persecution? Who can be targeted for gender persecution, and how does this fit under the definition of gender under the Rome Statute?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for that introduction and for that great question. Targeted group is element 2 under gender persecution for persecution for the Rome Statute, and it's interpreted very broadly. So really a targeted group is that group that is targeted by the perpetrator based on their gender, based on gender discrimination. So targeted groups typically look like men or women or LGBTQI plus persons. They could be boys or girls, or they could be any sort of subset of those groups. So those are just some examples of the kinds of targeted groups we often see based on gender discrimination. But targeted groups also include allies, they include sympathizers, they include those folks who are affiliated with a targeted group. They're included in that targeted group and may also themselves be targeted because of their affiliation, because of their support, or because of their engagement with that group that crosses a line in terms of what the perpetrator will allow. So that's a basic overview of targeted groups.
Thank you, Lisa. Valerie, building upon what Lisa just described, so could you speak to the specific gender criteria that are relevant for discriminatory targeting?
Sure, thank you. So at its most basic, when considering whether a victim group has been targeted for persecution on grounds of gender, we need to ask how socially constructed norms of maleness and femaleness played into that targeting. So for example, did the perpetrators try to force people into certain so-called gender boxes of female and male? I'll give you an example. This was very evident in the International Criminal Court's Al Hassan case, the trial for which recently concluded, and now we're waiting for a trial judgment. And in that case, there was a situation in Timbuktu, Mali, during a 10-month period in 2012 to 2013. And at that time, Timbuktu was under the control of 2 armed groups, Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. And these 2 armed groups imposed their extremist interpretation of Sharia law on the population, and together they explicitly targeted the inhabitants of the city on the basis of gender, with a special focus on women and girls. The 2 groups forced women and girls to abandon their traditional clothes and jewelry and required them to cover their head and body in specific ways. Women and girls were also prohibited from being alone with or speaking to men other than their husbands. Girls were banned from going to school with boys. Women were forbidden from going out at night. And if these women and girls violated or were perceived to have violated these edicts, they were severely punished, essentially for being outside of the gender female box created by these 2 armed groups. So for example, women and girls were subjected to 20 to 40 lashes if they were found in the company of men. And there was evidence presented by the prosecution of a 13-year-old girl who was arrested and raped in detention by a member of these groups simply because her veil had either fallen or dropped. And the prosecution put it in the closing trial argument in that case that women and girls were hunted down in the streets, in the schools and hospitals, and sometimes even in their own homes, and arrested, imprisoned, beaten, and raped if they did not comply. So that's one example. 2 specific questions that we need to consider with respect to the targeting of specific groups and individuals within a population on the basis of gender are: first, what form did the discrimination take? So for example, were people targeted because they were or were perceived to be LGBTQIA plus individuals, or perceived to be engaging in homosexual behavior? Another question we need to ask, the specific question is, were the targeted individuals perceived by the perpetrators not to properly fit into so-called male or female roles as defined by the same perpetrators. And I'll give you two examples from the policy paper. One example given is of men or boys who couldn't grow beards that were required as part of a dress code by perpetrators, and therefore seen as not being male enough, and they were targeted. Another example in the policy paper is of intersex, non-binary, or transgender persons who are targeted because the perpetrators perceived them as not belonging to either the male or men or female or women groups as perceived by the perpetrators. And the last point I want to make is one that Lisa just highlighted, that the targeted group must be viewed broadly. The targeted people don't in actuality need to be part of the targeted group. It's sufficient that they are viewed by the perpetrators as sympathizers or affiliates of the targeted group. And the example given in the policy paper, I think, really helps to allow you to imagine what that means. So if a perpetrator targets a girls' school because he wishes to prevent girls from attending, and in that attack kills men or boys who are staff at that school, then these men or boys are still considered part of the targeted group because they were perceived by the perpetrator to be affiliated or to sympathize with the girl's desire to get education. So what matters when evaluating the targeting is what was in the mind of the perpetrator, and we need to keep that in mind as we're evaluating targeting for gender persecution. And I'll end here. Thanks.
Thank you, Valerie. You kind of already touched upon something that I was going to ask Patricia next, but Patricia, maybe you can elaborate on the types of punishments that a perpetrator might inflict upon the targeted group. And in other words, what are the manifestations of the gender-based crime?
Thank you very much, and for the opportunity to speak at this webinar. Well, in terms of the punishment, I think we have to separate out two acts. On the one hand, the perpetrator might be reconstructing what they see as a proper, good Sharia society. And those very acts that they're reconstructing or making the inhabitants of a city do might be seen from the inhabitants as a type of punishment and a type of punishment that targets their gender. At the same time, because they don't fit into the image that the perpetrator wants for this society that they're reconstructing based upon gender performance and norms, that they can be punished because they have gone outside of those bounds. And there we could see punishment, of course, from detention to sexual violence, up until murder or up until banishment. I would like to interject one thing when we're talking about the construction of the group. We have to remember that all groups, even if they're perceived as political groups, religious groups, are gendered or have a gendered nature because they're made up of people who have genders. So you have to look at the intersectionality that could occur with gender persecution being done, as Lisa said before, against any collective identifiable group and against those allies. So it's very difficult to extract that gender persecution might not happen just because we're not looking at the group as only the per se gendered group of males or females or intersex. So if I were to take the example of, let's say, children who have been enslaved, their persecution might be based on their age, but how boy children and girl children are treated differently or punished could very well be because they've targeted gender within that group. And I'll stop here, but later on, I think that Valerie's point about the type of mindset or ideology of the perpetrator is very important.
Thank you, Patricia. Now, thinking more broadly, Victor, how do the gender criteria laid out by Valerie earlier impact the lives of the targeted groups?
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to actually come in at a time where Lisa and Valerie and Patricia have already done so much of the work, because they really have laid out how some of these issues relate. And I'm very grateful to be able to come in with some observations there. I wanted to, first of all, touch upon the very important point made by Patricia about intersectional frameworks of analysis, which in very many ways allow us to see dimensions in the way people are treated, in the way that they suffer indignity, in the way that they suffer violations that would otherwise be made invisible if we didn't have that dynamic in which we analyze the different identities that pile up in one body. Now, as to the criteria laid out, I think that 2 points are worthwhile mentioning. The first one is the whole notion of gender suffered a transformational a process when being incorporated in the Rome Statute. And of course, this is a point of reference for all of us who are working in international law and making reference to that framework of understanding roles and behaviors and attitudes that create a connection into from sex and the meaning of sex as such. However, two of the heritages of the political management of the notion of gender, one is that it has been understood in very many quarters politically as having a strong relation with a binary conception of sex. So in very many political fora, gender is seen as interchangeable with women. And you will hear often in human rights and public policy settings that when people talk about a gender policy, they are saying a policy on women and girls, for example. And so what the policy does, and it has taken a huge step forward, is to question that definitional framework and to actually take it forward with its emphasis in gender diversity and non-binary identities and the reality that a lot of people live in different axes of identification. The other point that to me is important is that this amplitude in the definitional framework and in the criteria laid out by Valerie also allow us to understand that very many people around the world do not necessarily identify within axes of identity that are, we could say, global West or global North. So in my experience, the acronym LGBT is very good to use as shorthand, and I use it as shorthand, but always in the awareness that there are many populations and communities around the world that will not identify themselves as lesbian, as gay, or bisexual, or trans, but still suffer discrimination and violence on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And all of this is what this criteria has laid out, and the policy allows us to do. Further, and this will be the last remark that I make in this segment, is what this policy allows us to do, and it has allowed me to do, is to use not only the analysis to identify damage on specific individuals, be it because they identify under particular diversities or because they are perceived, as mentioned quite clearly by all of my predecessors, but very importantly, it also allows us to study the instrumentalization of homophobic, lesbophobic, transphobic bias as a weapon of war. So let me just give an example. We all remember the images of Abu Ghraib in which prisoners were made to stand or pose in poses considered to be homosexual and taken pictures of as a way to humiliate them. Now, those persons were neither identifying explicitly, at least that I know, as LGBT or perceived to be. They were actually being humiliated through homophobic bias, through a way in which homophobic bias was being used as a particular method of humiliation and damage. And to me, these are the dimensions that are unlocked by creating all of this texture in the way in which gender and indeed sex actually have a role in within the dynamics of war.
Thank you, Victor. Very important points there. Returning to you, Lisa, now. The targeted group seems straightforward. Are there any challenges to identifying a targeted group?
Well, that's a great question. Certainly there have been challenges because we know that targeted groups has been limited in terms of how it's been reported under charges of persecution. I would be amiss not to mention that today, a new decision just came out of the HEP, which is the Transitional Justice Mechanism for Colombia, that has found for the first time ever in a transitional justice mechanism, gender persecution that was committed against women, girls, and LGBTQI plus persons. So that's a historic decision that I think that we can learn a lot from, and is starting us on the right path to our better understanding of how this crime works. But the idea of missing the targeted group is problematic because the targeted group is often what helps us see where gender persecution exists. So going back to the example that Valerie brought up, that's in the policy paper, if a school was bombed. So if a school was bombed, we know everyone in that bombing can be part of that targeted group. And if a school was bombed, say, because the perpetrator didn't want girls accessing education, then it's not just girls who become a part of that victims group who are targeted. It's everyone in that school. It's the principal. It's the male and female teachers. It's the father walking his daughter to school. It's the custodian. That becomes everyone who's targeted. But if I walk in, I'm an investigator, and I walk in and I look at that bombing, I may miss gender persecution. I might say, well, I see men, women, girls, boys that have been victims in this bombing. I don't see gender persecution because I don't see just girls being targeted, for example. I need to take a step back and look at why the perpetrator was enacting what they were enacting, to see the discriminatory intent, the intent to prohibit girls from accessing education. Then I can see the targeted group. Then I can see all of the victims that fall under that crime. Then I can see the gender persecution. Otherwise, we run the risk of not seeing gender persecution when it happens. And this is particularly poignant, as Patty said, at the points of intersectionality. So if we're looking at crimes of murder or rape or torture on ethnic or religious groups, we have to look to see if there are intersecting forms of persecution happening there. For example, in Colombia, the HEP is looking at, and activists have been reporting on, sexual violence that happened against Black and Indigenous women because of their ethnicity and also because they're women, that these are intersecting points of persecution. And that's really important because that's how we tell the story of what happens in conflict. We can unearth racist and misogynist and homophobic narratives that drive and exacerbate crimes and conflict so that we can actually address them in post-conflict reconstruction and transitional justice processes.
Lisa, let me pick up on something you just said about the intent, because we have a question in the Q&A related to that, which says, how does a prosecutor prove intent to harm or attack the targeted group based on gender, age, or other attributes for the purposes of persecution, or what kinds of evidence prove this mindset that Ms. Sellers just mentioned? And I'm gonna give that to Patricia again, since you were mentioned there, and then Lisa, you can build upon that if you have anything to add.
All right. Well, thank you. There are many ways that you can prove the discriminatory intent. Often it is from the utterances, from the words, from what the perpetrator has already explained to be their means of reconstructing this society where they have power over inhabitants. I think often we underlook the very directive messages that are given to the subordinates of a perpetrator in order to say, make sure the inhabitants now dress in that way, that women look in this way, that one cannot express any tendencies of homosexuality. So that's one way, direct evidence of policies. Another way could be very circumstantial, that everyone starts to understand now what are the gender boundaries that I will be held in, that if I break, then a punishment from the perpetrator will come even beyond the punishment of these gender restrictions. So you could have a type of circumstantial evidence, a direct evidence, but also you can even see from hindsight and going backwards, what is the impact of these policies? What were the impact of now how the society changed, to say that this must have been because of the discriminatory intent that the perpetrator began with to restructure their societies. And if I can just give one example that we often overlook, we see that historically in many incidences of armed conflict, but even in non-armed conflict, that homosexual males will be castigated. Homosexual women or lesbians will hide themselves more. But we know that what's happening is a policy somewhere has gone out and that inhabitants are reacting. And that's a way of looking at that as evidence of the intent of the perpetrator.
Thank you. Lisa, do you have anything to add? There's another question also on the same topic.
I'll just add really quickly in terms of evidence that you can look at. You know, it's like Patty said, look at the policies, look at the regulations, but you can also find these things. You can find intent in, you know, leaflets, posters, graffiti, social media, tweets by perpetrators. All of these things can be evidence of the intent to discriminate based on gender.
Thank you both. So going back a little bit, so Valerie, you are a former member of the Canadian delegation to the UN Conference on the Establishment of the ICC. You supported the negotiation of various gender provisions, including the definition of gender used in gender persecution. So during this conference, what limits did delegates see with that definition for the prosecution of gender persecution? And has the ICC interpretation of gender and gender persecution evolved since then? And are there these limits that were back in 1998 still a concern?
Thank you. So during the negotiation of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, gender was listed alongside a number of persecutory grounds in a particular article, Article 7(1)(h) of that statute. And it was listed alongside political, racial, national, ethnic, cultural, religious, and other grounds that are universally recognized as impermissible under international law. And of all of these grounds, only one was defined in the Rome Statute, and that was the term gender. So Article 7 sub 3 indicates that gender means the two sexes, male and female, within the context of society. And this definition was the result of polarized discussions at the final diplomatic conference of the International Criminal Court in 1998, in which a majority of states pressed for a definition that understood gender as a socially constructed norm that differs from society to society and over time. And a minority of conservative states wanted to restrict the term to mean biological sex and to exclude rights for LGBTQIA+ individuals, an agenda that they also pursued in United Nations human rights fora at the time and still today, as I'm sure Victor could attest to. So the result was this skeletal definition, which was the result of what diplomats call constructive ambiguity. And what that means is that the actual definition was left somewhat ambiguous or opaque so as to get agreement at that moment in time, but it pushes clarification to another later date and by someone else. And in this case, the International Criminal Court's Office of the Prosecutor and the judges. And for those who are watching this webinar, there is an excellent blog post on just security by Yvonne Dutton and Melanie Stereo describing exactly these negotiations. So this definition created confusion in the International Criminal Court's Office of the Prosecutor for some time, and gender persecution wasn't charged. However, the International Criminal Court Prosecutor's 2014 policy paper on sexual and gender-based crimes was a really important development in my view, because it clarified the term gender for the Office of the Prosecutor. And that policy indicates that the term acknowledges the social construction of gender and the accompanying roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes assigned to women and men and to girls and boys. And then much more recently, in 2022, the prosecutor's policy on the crime of gender persecution, which we're talking about today, specifies that the term gender refers to sex characteristics and social constructs and criteria to define maleness and femaleness, including roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes. And it adds that as a social construct, gender varies within societies and from society to society and can change over time. So to answer the question directly, there's now much more understanding within the Office of the Prosecutor on the meaning of the term gender, and therefore much more willingness to charge gender persecution, as we saw in the Al Hassan case and in other cases and situations. And this evolution means that the original confusion is much less relevant now. The one way that I could see it arising is perhaps with respect to defense counsel trying to rely on the International Criminal Court negotiations and the ambiguity in the original definition to try to argue that, for example, LGBTQIA+ discrimination is somehow not included. But I think that particular argument is definitely no longer supportable. Thanks.
Thank you, Valerie. Good to see that evolution and that we're moving towards the right direction. Let me turn to Patricia now. From your experience working with justice mechanisms, what causes and motivations have you observed the perpetrators have for committing gender-based crimes? And how does a comprehensive assessment of gender-based crimes impact the analysis of what crimes have been committed in conflict situations?
Well, I think that we can all see from our own experiences is that we are the fruition or the product of gendered societies. There's not one of us who doesn't understand the codes of whether we're male, female, whether we're anywhere on the binary. We recognize people by gendered codes. Our speech might even change in terms of gendered situations. And we also understand that all the perpetrators come from the different societies around the world that have a gender code. Most of our religions have a gender code. Most of our economies and businesses have a gender code. So the perpetrator comes in with codes. And with these codes, they attach the idea of what types of aims and goals do they want to achieve via the commission of crimes. War crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide. So it is little wonder that they come and they impose a gendered point of view as they carry out these crimes and as they reach the aims of their own motivations. I do want to say that it's very difficult to find any armed conflict or genocide or crimes against humanity that does not lay clearer the actual atrocities when one looks at it from a gender competent perspective. And so it is not surprising that the gendered aims of the perpetrator often involve suppression of certain what they consider gender freedoms, reconstruction of gender, and of course, a way to enforce obedience. And because they're in the process of committing war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide, that those processes entail often violence, whether it's psychological, whether it's physical, and the deprivation of fundamental human rights. So they'll create a system wherein education is denied, where the right to be free from slavery is abolished, where the right not to be arbitrarily detained is abolished. But within those egregious types of deprivation of fundamental human rights, there'll be a gendered construction of it. So maybe boys will go to school, but girls won't go to school. Maybe the enslaved female who is under 10 will have certain types of gendered jobs that the older female doesn't, while the older female might become a situation of forced marriage. And maybe in the arbitrary detention, we always and often see the separation of genders during detention and certain harms inflicted upon those considered females and those considered males. And I really just want to take advantage of underscoring Victor's point about Abu Ghraib. It was the weaponization or the utilization of homophobism as a form of torture. And we can see at times, such as in the context that Lisa brought forward, where Afro-Colombian women, it's their gendered perception by the perpetrator being hypersexualized that might have led much more to the sexual violence that was inflicted upon them. Those Afro-Colombian women, they like that. And that was a form of gender persecution in addition to forms of rape and to other forms of social and psycho and sexual violence.
Thank you for that clarification and examples. Let me now move on to the United Nations. Victor, you have ample experience working on issues related to violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, including by overseeing a draft policy on the torture and ill treatment of LGBTQI persons. During your work at the UN, what are the main challenges and violations you observed that women, men, children, and LGBTQI plus persons experience because of their gender identity? And I know that we've discussed some of them already, but could you add anything more to that?
Well, I think you can actually classify different challenges in different levels. Clearly, at the political level, in the international discussion, we are seeing a significant trend towards questioning gender-based frameworks or the extent to which gender-based frameworks are applicable under international human rights law and international law in general. So, including, of course, the idea that has become kind of a standard instruction in many ministries of foreign affairs, that in political negotiations at the international level, there should be determination to substitute the word gender in resolutions with equality between men and women, thereby reinforcing a very binary notion and a very restricted notion of the understanding of sex and roles, of course, within society. When it comes to specific individuals and the patterns that we can see, I think that it's very important to note, I think Lisa already alluded to this, very many of the violations are in fact inflicted to larger social discriminatory patterns. And so, for example, criminalization and the use of criminalization in armed conflict and other situations is actually quite a pervasive trait. Exclusionary social norms, to which also Lisa was making reference to. All of these are used both strategically and tactically by conflict actors in armed conflict. And one example is the Taliban takes over of Afghanistan in 2021, where my mandate received an increased amount of specific cases that noted that the safety of LGBT and gender diverse person had become considerably more precarious. Now, other particular perpetrations are actually the ones that blur the line between intentional and structural dynamics that promote the obviation, that's the negation that people's LGBT people's vulnerability exists during war and other situations that are extreme. Enforcing the gendered binary and social practices that hammer in place cis heteronormative structures forces compel LGBT and gender diverse persons to hide their identity and suppress their very personhood. And the type of violations that we see in that context, of course, oftentimes relate to sexual violence, given its connection to the identity that we're talking about, but also torture, imprisonment, death, forced displacement. And I'd like to just quickly cite the Commission for Clarification of Truth, Coexistence, and Non-Repetition in Colombia in its recent report, where they say each group with a particular pattern persecuted LGBTIQ+ people because of their sexual orientations and non-normative gender identities and expressions to consolidate population control in the territories, imposing or reaffirming moral, social, political, economic, and military orders that are considered quote-unquote correct, and to obtain or maintain legitimacy before the citizens who saw them as quote-unquote undesirable in order to win the war. So we see there exactly how it is that particular targeting is also instrumentalized as strategically within parties in a conflict.
Thank you, Victor. Let me now turn to some of the questions that we have received through the Q&A function. So first of all, could there's a question, could you talk more to prosecuting gender persecution beyond a Western or global Northern understanding of gender and sexual identity? We've touched upon it in different answers, but can anyone pick up on that?
Well, I think we're talking about gender under the universal understanding in terms of what gender discrimination means. And it's not specific to culture or to any particular state. And it happens everywhere in the world, in both the global North and the global South. The example that I always give to my students is World War II and the persecution of homosexuals under the Nazis. We're also seeing evidence of crimes that may amount to gender persecution in Ukraine. So it's a global issue. But when we're talking about gender-based crimes in their universal perspective, we're talking about that discriminatory intent that drives those crimes. So whether you're talking about honor killings in Baghdad, or you're talking about femicides in Latin America, or you're talking about, the abuse of domestic workers in the United States, or different forms of domestic violence that is ignored. All of it has a universal aspect to it, and that's that intent to discriminate. So it really doesn't change in that aspect, depending on where you go or how you label it. That's what brings it into its universality. That's what makes it unacceptable under international law. So I think we're talking more about how gender discrimination works under international law and across the globe.
Thank you, Lisa. And then another question is, how can gender persecution be prosecuted outside the context of armed conflict? And I think we made a few examples to context out where it isn't an armed conflict, but how do you prosecute those contexts?
Look, I'll take that one because maybe we haven't underscored the fact that persecution is a provision under Article 7 of the International Criminal Court that deals with crimes against humanity. And crimes against humanity does not have to occur during an armed conflict. It could, but there's no requirement that an armed conflict exists prior to pursuing evidence of crimes against humanity. So as the Rome Statute is structured now, and as customary law is structured now, persecution does not have to be pursued within the context of an armed conflict. Often it is. But I think possibly what the question is getting to of what I call is almost the everyday persecution. I mean, the extreme discrimination based upon gender that we see in certain situations that we have so normalized that to invisibilize it, such as in Uganda, outlawing homosexual acts, whether it's places in the world, in the Cambodia tribunal, that we know that they went after men who presented feminine as part of the crimes against humanity perpetrated. So I think that we can start to do that by just looking at national provisions for crimes against humanity that contain persecution and then persecution based upon gender grounds.
Thank you, Patricia. And there's a related question to what you said about national provision. So how does this policy of gender persecution interact with domestic justice processes? We spoke about HEP, but how perhaps, how do you make those connections? I will pick on Valerie this time.
Sure. So long as a country has within its criminal provisions crimes against humanity, including gender persecution. So, for example, in countries that have domesticated the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, then prosecutions can happen in those countries with respect to gender persecution as a crime against humanity. So I'll explain one connection that we can see directly with respect to the International Criminal Court, and that is that the International Criminal Court operates on the principle of complementarity. So if a domestic country, if a country wishes to pursue gender persecution as a crime against humanity within its own legal system, and it is able and willing to do so, then the ICC, the International Criminal Court, is meant to step aside and let that unfold in that country. So that's one way in which we see domestic consideration happen. I must confess that gender persecution is not prosecuted enough at the domestic level as a crime against humanity. But we have seen this discussion, as Lisa outlined today, within the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia, and that's a really promising start.
Thank you. Now I'll go to Victor, because you raised this notion of intersectionality. And so one of the questions is, how is intersectionality considered when identifying targeted groups?
Well, I think that there's two dimensions to that answer. The first one is the use of intersectional frameworks for analysis is both a political statement of intent to look into all of these dimensions, but it's also a methodological decision. It implies that you're going to be looking at data across the board in relation to the series of identities that are relevant to place a person in a particular position of privilege, or in most cases, in situations of exposure to violence, discrimination, and persecution in the specific case that we're talking about. And the way that I look at it is that then you have points of entry into that analysis. I, for example, am an independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. So my primary source of data is LGBT persons or other persons persecuted on the basis of that angle. But then the granularity of actually understanding how socioeconomic standing actually relates to that, or how racialization of violence plays a role in relation to that analysis, demands that I look into data that actually cross-references those populations and communities and allows me to identify trends that then, upon which then I can build some working theories. So clearly, we're going to talk about Colombia for years to come because of their very advanced exercise. But when I look at the decision issued in the last 24 hours in Colombia, what I look is that their methodological description actually starts by mentioning that they identified different layers, and they could actually see how, for example, campesino status, or peasant, I suppose is the word in English, actually played a fundamental role in creating more exposure to violence. How Black communities actually were suffering disproportionately, even within LGBT communities. And this allows a last point in relation to the way that this goes. It also demands that we deconstruct the hegemonization that we have built in our heads. For example, LGBT doesn't represent a homogeneous society, community. It actually represents a number of different identities that in very many cases can be persecuted differently in different contexts. Patricia was mentioning particular example of trans persons or persons presenting as feminine in contexts where other communities will not be persecuted in the same way. The use of, and this is where the political dimension of the statement comes in, is a continued commitment to discover different angles of analysis that exacerbate exposure to risk and indeed to actual persecution.
Thank you, Victor. I will turn to
Excuse
Lisa.
me, can I jump
Sorry,
in there
go
for
ahead.
a second?
Yes.
I just want to add on to Victor's last sentence that it's a continual exercise. If we really understand that persecution based upon gender discrimination comes under crimes against humanity, it's a continual exercise to protect us from us and our humanity from an attack that's based upon gender. So I really appreciate we have to keep folding back and getting the data and understanding who we are so that we can understand what are the safeguards that we need as representative of the civilian population and of humanity.
Thank you for that addition. Now, Lisa, there's a question about the OTP. So how will the OTP be guided in ensuring that its understanding of gender accounts for coloniality, meaning the ways in which control over economy, governance, sexuality, land, and knowledge in the past has ongoing consequences for the present and the future?
Well, I think that's a great question because we certainly have to look back at history to know where we're going in the future. One example that we've been talking about that touches on this is looking at narratives, stereotypes, and other discriminatory beliefs that come out of colonialism. And how do they play into the persecution that we see? And that really, again, goes back to looking at persecution from an intersectional lens, that we can't just look at gender persecution in a silo. We can't just say what's happening to, say, women in a particular conflict. We have to look at all of the different aspects of a person's identity and what makes them who they are and how that may have fed beliefs that the perpetrator is imposing on them. So looking at the racist stereotypes that have persisted through time and history that justified acts of slavery and other hideous crimes is how we understand the foundation of racism. And if we're really going to uproot racism, if we're really going to uproot misogyny, we have to understand where these narratives come from and how they currently feed conflicts that are happening now, which is why it's so incredibly important to look at these issues from an intersectional lens, or we miss them. We miss them, and we miss the understanding of what happens in conflict. I mean, sure, we'll get the underlying crimes, most likely. We'll get the rape and the torture and the murder. But if we don't understand why these crimes happen, why the perpetrator did what they did, then we're only getting half the story. And if we only get half the story, how are we ever going to uproot racism and misogyny and homophobia? We can't. And that's the whole purpose of persecution. The idea is that it is a crime that helps us understand why the underlying crimes themselves happened, why or how racist or misogynist beliefs fueled the acts that took place. So to understand that, we have to understand where they came from, and we have to understand how they still exist today. We have to recognize that they still exist today everywhere in the world, and that we have a tool to do something about them, at least to start building the awareness for a foundation to peace afterwards. Because if we don't understand where racism comes from or misogyny comes from, we can't build sustainable peace. At least that's what I believe.
Victor, I saw you wanted to jump in.
The reference to colonialism made me think of, I just finalized an inquiry there, and I'll be very, very short. I just wanted to bring in an example that in my view illustrates quite clearly the way in which these concepts have been used to ascertain certain power structures. In the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, the researcher, it's very clear that Portuguese colonizers in Mozambique actually used the structure of the heteronormative family to actually erode the structures of social solidarity that existed in the country, which were based on a tribe understanding of solidarity, which were actually powerful structures and networks as a way to ensure the colonial domination by eroding those structures. And the other example is, of course, the way in which gendered and stratified ways of dress in Europe during colonial times actually made their way to a number of countries, colonized countries, and led to legislation on cross-dressing that has been used, of course, to persecute gender diverse persons. So you have there the idea that this is also put to the service of the very exercise of colonial domination.
Thank you very much, both. So there's one question in the Q&A, which refers to working towards making sure that everybody treats gender crimes more seriously, and to make sure that gender crimes are less marginalized within the International Criminal Court. And what are the biggest obstacles in doing so? And I will combine that with some last thoughts from everyone. So I'll do Valerie, Patricia, Victor, and then Lisa, just a minute of some concluding thoughts, and perhaps if you can tie that question in.
Sure. So there are many things going on right at this moment in time that are really important for advancing our understanding of gender and gender persecution. The implementation of the 2022 policy on gender persecution is one, and the revising of the 2014 policy on sexual and gender-based crimes of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and the 2016 child policy is another. So bringing those up to date, incorporating deeper gender analysis and more lessons learned. And I think that this is something that the audience should keep an eye out for when they're launched later this year at the International Criminal Court's Assembly of States Parties.
Okay, I'll go next. And I think one of the issues that should remain in our forefront, we as just members of the international community, or whether you're practitioners, academics, or going about your daily life, is that it is rare to be in any function and for it not to be gendered. That gender is something that we swim in, and it is not the one-off or unusual state. And that to transfer that to crimes, most crimes by their very nature have some type of gendered impact, if not gender directiveness, intent, or they have a lasting gender legacy, whether it be the killing basically of men at war that leave female or femaleness, or whether it be the removal of certain persons whose sexual orientation that we don't want. So we try to remove it from society or suppress it from society. This gendered nature is something that we all have to live with every day and that we should protect every day. And this is the opportune time. And so I just want to mention that there's a Crimes Against Humanity treaty that's currently going through the United Nations, and gender is very important to make sure that we do protect crimes against humanity by not removing the protections that we're starting to get with the gender policy from the Office of the Prosecutor.
I'll go next in the order that you said, Cynthia. I'd like to pick up on that last point that Patricia made. I think it's a major process that we need to keep very vigilant of, this Crimes Against Humanity treaty. A number of colleagues and I presented a position paper in this process to the International Law Commission, advocating for this inclusive definition of gender-based frameworks and ensuring that they are understood to cover this diversity to which Patricia has made reference so clearly. I also think that as a result of the recent inquiries that I've been carrying out, one of the issues that remains important, I think, is ensuring that continuous exercise of questioning whether the definitional framework is ample enough, inclusive enough, to maintain an eye out for all forms of diversity under which people identify and live, and in a way decolonialize also language concerning sexual orientation and gender identity is kind of the next frontier where the global movement will be deploying significant work.
Okay, I guess I would just say that, gender persecution is an old tool for recognizing old crimes, but in many ways it's a new tool because we've just never used it before. And it's not by random chance that we've had such a dearth of recognition of gender persecution crimes and conflict. In many ways, we just haven't understood or had the willingness to recognize gender-based crimes and conflicts, at least outside of sexual violence, which I think still is a struggle to hold accountable in and of itself as well. So there's a reason for that. There's a reason we don't see these crimes and that we're just starting to awaken to them now. And it's not because they haven't been around for decades. It's because we haven't had that willingness to see how deeply gender affects all of us. And as someone once great said to me, part of what we are trying to do here in terms of protecting rights is protecting rights, not just for some of us, but for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That's all the time we've got today. Thank you for joining us and submitting your really great questions. The webinar recording will be available on the PLPG website and shared with all the attendees via email. This event was part of PLPG Thought Leadership Initiative. This event is the third in the series of events that we're holding on the policy of gender persecution. I am deeply grateful to all of our panelists for taking the time today to talk about this policy and to our audience for their engaging questions. Join us on September 22nd for the next event of this series on the intent to discriminate. Thank you, everyone.